Welcome to the Immersive Learning Research Network's 9th annual conference. We have a featured speaker session now with Maria Andrei, Catherine Cassidy, and Alan Miller from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, presenting on digital action on climate change in heritage environments. And take it away.
Thank you very much for that introduction, John. I'm Alan Miller, and my colleagues Catherine Cassidy and Maria Andrei will follow up. And thank you very much for the feature and the invitation to address this conference. It's very much appreciated, and we are part of a group called the Open Virtual Worlds Group at University of St. Andrews, and we've been participating in this conference, I think, since the first one over the last 9 years, and we've been doing immersive learning for a few years longer than that, since about 2005, 2006. We're based in computer science department. If we could move on to the next slide. And a lot of our focus has been about how we can use digital technologies, and in particular immersive technologies, in the context of heritage and in the context of learning about heritage, starting off really looking at making reconstructions of a lovely cathedral that we have in St. Andrews and Sparta Basilica with some Rebecca Sweetman and Professor Fawcett, respectively, which is very much part of doing learning in the archaeology and history side of the university and of learning, enable people to experience what these spaces were like. And we found also that fairly quickly that through a Heritage Lottery Fund project with Tom Dawson and with museums in Timespan and Eyemouth and Shetland and North Uist, making digital reconstructions worked really well as virtual exhibits, enabling people to come into the museum and really appreciate the essence and the history of these historic monuments, and to come to grips really quickly with understanding that maybe you've developed through years and decades of archaeologists and historians subjecting this and historians studying the sites. Through the immersive technologies, people were able to gain that understanding really quickly. And we've been finding then, since then, there's been a sort of rapid development in digital literacies that people have, and with the capabilities of immersive technologies have also come on leaps and bounds. And so these technologies have been great, really, as a means of doing immersive learning and experiential learning. I mean, a lot of what we've done has been focused on trying to develop scenarios where people can learn through their own experience, and leveraging the capabilities of computers so that people can widen their experience, and in this case their experience of the past, so that we can use simulation so that people can experience what a 12th century monastery in Europe was like, or what the Highland clearances in the 18th century were like, and so on. And I suppose that if we next slide, if we then think about, and we have been thinking about and starting to act on the challenge of climate change. Climate change is an ongoing challenge, but it's one that has been gathering in momentum. You know, the last 10 years have been the hottest 10 years in history, and we expect that this acceleration, there's this target of trying to keep global warming to 1.5%, and that's likely to be broken, sadly, in the next 5 to 6 years. And the more global warming there is, the faster the accelerators are. And so we're living in a world where, in a sense, climate change, which has a number of characteristics such as heavy rainfall, drought, flooding, high summer temperatures, new forms of pests, changed growing seasons, wildfire. It's kind of, we think it's a sort of existential crisis, or you know, of our lifetimes. It will be sort of defining as to what the future of humankind is. And so we think that the immersive technologies that we've been using, how can they be used to address this crisis? And if we move on, so one of the things is in the last few years, there's been a consensus. There's been a consensus change. I just got a little bit. There's been a consensus change. There's been a change in the consensus about the relationship between climate and heritage. And so what I mean by that is that the UNESCO, the EU, and museum societies have all been looking at this problem, and have all come to the conclusion that the impact of climate change is becoming very serious with respect to the heritage that we have in the world. So that if we look, for instance, at UNESCO, we see that there's this report on world heritage and climate change. So there's a whole series of world heritage sites around the world, and climate change has been impacting negatively on those. So if we look at culture, and we look at we look at intangible cultural heritage, we see that also has been undermined. The way in which people live has been undermined and has been challenged, and so the potential of losing examples of intangible cultural heritage, and also with the artifacts. So really quite all the way across the spectrum of different forms of heritage, climate change is kind of impacting upon those. And this research agenda and action agenda on culture, heritage, and climate change, which is coming out of UNESCO and ICOMOS, sets out a whole series of different challenges. And we believe that immersive technologies can contribute to understanding and solutions for those challenges. Yeah, if we move on to the next, then that would be great. And the European Commission observes that, this also has become really core with the new Green Deal to European policy. The information gathered by a group of experts is alarming, as climate change is directly and indirectly threatening all forms of cultural heritage, among others through severe precipitation, long heat waves, droughts, strong winds, and sea level rise, all of which are expected to increase in the future. And so cultural heritage is being seen by the European Commission as an important aspect in terms of the effects of climate change. But if we move on, then the national, NEMO, the Network of European Museum Organizations, which I'm pleased to announce we have just joined and become a part of, and they've set up as one of their two main working groups, a working group on climate change that we're looking forward to contributing to. But their notion of museums and sustainability report of museums in the climate crisis, which is something which has been developed through a big survey of hundreds of museums across Europe. So there's this statement: acknowledge and support the potential of museums as allies to help the public better understand climate change and to become active. And so what this is doing is it's not just seeing cultural heritage as a victim and an object of climate change, as something that receives damage and is threatened by climate change, but it's also seeing the institutions of heritage as an active participant in the process, which can contribute to people developing their developing an understanding and appreciation of the scale and nature of the threat, and then also of the actions that may be required to meet that threat. And so that's a kind of like a big step forward in terms of the heritage sector and climate change. And also I think a similar thing applies to immersive technologies. 8 in 10 museums in Europe have acknowledged climate change and sustainability as important strategic topics, and nearly 7 in 10 museums. Now, I don't know what it's like internationally, but certainly in the UK, schools take the climate crisis fairly seriously. It's part of the curriculum that you know, young children are learning about it and are pretty much up on it. But you know, when I went to school, it wasn't part of the curriculum at all, and when I went to university, it wasn't part of the curriculum at all. And so there's this big challenge, I think, in terms of lifelong learning. It's not just that it's not just that, you know, one of the challenges is that we see learning in this. Most people see learning as something that you do, you know, you start it at, you know, I don't know, 4 or 5, and it goes on till 18 when you're at school. And then there's another chunk of learning that you do at university, and you exit that after, you know, 3, 8, 3, 5 or 6 years, depending upon what you're doing and how well you're doing and so on. And then, you know, you go to work and you do your job. But I think we have to have this concept of lifelong learning, but there aren't the institutions in place. The only real institutions that are in place that are committed to lifelong learning are museums in the heritage sector and libraries and galleries, museums, libraries and galleries. And this network of institutions are taking up the challenge of climate change, and we need to be part and parcel of that process. And so if we just move on, and one of the organizations from the respect, yes, the next slide, please, from the perspective of heritage and climate change is the Climate Heritage Network. And it's got hundreds of members all of the way around the globe, and is working and feeding into the UNESCO, United Nations COP Council of Parties, so COP28 this year process, which is a sort of international organization that is responsible for addressing climate change amongst others. And the Climate Heritage Network is a free network which has loads of resources, and it's a great place to join. So I've just mentioned this here. So if you are, you know, part of an organization, which we all are, then seriously consider joining the Climate Heritage Network. It would be a good thing to do. Our Open Virtual Worlds group has joined. We're hoping the University of St Andrews will join soon, and the iLRN and others will join as well. So that's something that we can do. And so if we're thinking about how we respond to climate change, I think there's 4 areas that we can think about. So the first is monitoring the impact on heritage. And by doing this, we monitor the impact of climate change. So we have, you know, network of people measuring the change in weather, change in temperature, and these sorts of things. But local monitoring is important as well, to know what the effect has been upon a particular archaeological site, to know what has been the effect on biodiversity. These things may be, you know, a bird arriving out of season. These sorts of things may be important in terms of monitoring what the effect and the impact of climate change has been. And citizen science involving the population and involving heritage organizations in this can contribute to that. The second is adapting to changes in climate change. Unfortunately, there's not going to be no climate change. The climate change is taking place, and so we need policies, local policies in place to minimize the negative impacts of climate change that is happening. But then mitigating the impact of climate change is also important for the heritage sector. So that means making sure that we minimize carbon gases that are put into the environment So, for example, museums may encourage people to arrive by foot, by bicycle, by public transport, therefore reducing the cost that the sort of private car travel has. Or we may look at how they can use renewable energy in their context. But at the end of the day, that's the sector can do some of this stuff in terms of mitigating. But a lot of the time we work with small museums, we work with them in remote locations with small populations, but with lots of tourists who come by during the summer or whatever. And therefore this notion of communicating the impact of climate change in order to achieve behavioral change at the level of individuals, at the level of corporations, institutions and governments. So communicating the impact of climate change in order to develop an understanding and develop a pressure to achieve the changes needed to halt and reverse climate change is something which is central to addressing the climate crisis and central to the heritage organizations addressing the climate crisis. We work, for example, with North Uist that have a great policies and practice with respect to climate change and sustainability, but the numbers of people who live there and are very vulnerable to climate change as well. They're very vulnerable to sea level rises. But that's something that Maria is going to talk about. So I won't. And just to say a small thing that we did at St Andrews as part of a IS 500 and as part of a course on climate change, on digital promotion and preservation of heritage, if we go to the next slide, was to develop a world map showing a whole range of different pieces of heritage around the globe, and for each of those identifying what the impacts of climate change were. And then for the next slide, for choosing places from the Great Wall of China to St Kilda, again, heritage sites, intangible heritage and objects around the world, developing action plans which identify what are the cultural contributions of those heritage sites and what can be done to both to preserve them and to communicate from them the effect and the impact of climate change around the world. So I'm hoping now that Maria will pick up where I started to sort of mention stuff about North Uist and some of the local activities around climate change.
Sure, thank you so much, Alan. Just wanted to check that you can hear me okay. All good? Cool. So I thought we also, thank you. I thought we could start just by refreshing into our minds what climate change is defined as. So climate change refers to long-term changes in the composition of the climate, and that can include aspects like precipitation, wind, or temperature rise. And these can either be driven naturally for things like solar explosions or volcanic eruptions to being influenced by human activity. And we actually have quite a lot of evidence showing us just how much influence people have had on the global climate. So, for example, a spike in the mid-1800s in human activity perfectly coincided with the huge rise in global temperatures, which is a phenomenon also known as the Great Acceleration. And unfortunately, this leads to devastating impacts that have been mentioned a bit before, such as sea level rise, also biodiversity loss, extreme weather events from wildfires to extreme storms, and so on. If we could move on to the next slide, please. Despite the fact that the impacts of climate change are devastating, and this conversation has gotten a lot of attention recently, through my research as a PhD student at the University of St Andrews, I discovered that climate change information is still seen as abstract, and that's for a few reasons. Firstly, because a lot of the impacts are distant from our locality, and also they relate to future processes that are very slow. And unfortunately, from a psychological point of view, abstract information does not motivate human action. The only information that has a big influence on human behavior is concrete information. And this phenomenon is known as psychological distance from climate change, and is a big reason why climate action is currently very hindered. And a lot of research projects have shown that reducing psychological distance from climate change has been shown to increase ecological behavior. And what's more, a few research projects have shown us that VR can support scientists on this mission, because VR enables us to immerse ourselves in situations that we couldn't otherwise experience. And also there's not many alternatives to visualization in which you can make abstract information concrete. Visualization is a very concrete way of assimilating information. And although there have been a few projects that try to really raise awareness on the impacts of climate change, unfortunately, they are quite scarce, and most of them are inaccessible, either because they aren't available online or they require really expensive hardware in order to engage with. So our research aim is really to develop our own climate VR simulations that showcase the future climates in key regions for the climate conversation. And eventually, hopefully, we can get simulations of what particular areas look like in the past and be able to compare them with the present and with the future climates in these environments. And we really want to make sure these can be accessible, which is why we're really focusing on our museum network. And we hope to create a lot of exhibitions that will be global through museums in order to promote climate education. And also we're going to focus on the online environment and create a digital exhibition that can be self-sufficient, which might not require any like expensive hardware or anything, so we can reach more people. Could you please go to the next slide? So from my research, it became apparent that although Antarctica and Scotland are two regions that are very, very important for the climate conversation, and they hold national and international importance in terms of economics as well as ecological and social importance, there are actually no climate VR experiences that try to visualize how climate change is expected to affect these two environments in the future. So one of my case studies, one of the climate VR simulations I'm focusing on at the moment, is of an area called Paradise Bay in Antarctica. And this area belongs to the Antarctic Western Peninsula. And a big reason why I chose it is because this is the fastest warming region on the planet. Not only that, but the Antarctic Peninsula is the most visited area of Antarctica, with over 70,000 visitors per year. And in general, this area, as you can imagine, is tremendously important for regulating the global climate. Firstly, because it has multiple aspects in which it produces the global carbon sink. So I've included here a picture of Antarctic krill, for example, which is one of the most abundant animals in that particular ecosystem. And it basically helps through its own biological processes to sink carbon into the ocean, but it also helps with the production of particular algae that are very important for reflecting sunlight. And due to the decreasing sea level, due to the decreasing sea ice in Antarctica right now, it is possible nowadays to fish for krill all year long, whereas in the past, during the polar winter, the ocean was literally too covered and fishermen weren't able to actually go and capture this crustacean. But right now, for example, it's completely possible to fish for it all year long. Obviously, there's very important glaciers that reside in Antarctica as well, and they largely contribute to global sea level rise. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. This is kind of a snapshot of my simulation of Antarctica in its current stage. Everything is based on real elevation and water data, and this is what Paradise Bay looks like. in its present state. Obviously, this is in its early development stage. So my hope for this is to include the animals, the flora as well, and then simulate what it's expected to look like in the future. If we could move on, please. Here we can just go to the other slide. Thank you. And on the note of sea level rise, as Alan has mentioned, not only North Uist, which is an island in the western region of Scotland, but in Scotland in general, the coastline is very vulnerable to sea level rise. One of the reasons I chose to focus my other climate simulation on North Uist is because this particular area holds a lot of national and international value for a few reasons. Firstly, it is at the heart of the Gaelic speaking community for Scotland, and a lot of Gaelic speaking regions are very threatened from increased storminess and sea level rise due to climate change, but especially in North Uist, this is a really spoken language. So climate change directly threatens this particular cultural heritage. The Isle hosts about 1,600 people, and it also possesses a lot of value for nature conservation because it hosts some very rare ecosystems. So the ones I've included in the slide, for example, is Maher soil, which actually is very important again for the global carbon sink and for regulating the global climate. It's super important for biodiversity. And this is a very rare soil that resides in the UK and in Northern Ireland, but most of it is actually found in this isle. And unfortunately, a lot of areas now are eroding due to sea level rise, and this particular soil grows very closely to the sea, so it's very threatened from sea level rise and flooding events. Another important ecological aspect of North Uist are the saline lagoons systems. So these are basically shallow water that reside between land and sea, and they're very niche ecosystems that host very particular marine animals. They also play a huge role for carbon sink. And again, the most complex such system is found in North Uist. And due to climate change, the Isle is not only threatened by sea level rise and coastal erosion, but as I mentioned before, a lot of more extreme storms are going to happen. And this directly threatens a lot of businesses and households. There's already been incidents where, due to storms, access roads have been shut down. And that really hinders the ability of the population to access either medical facilities, educational facilities, or just really necessary facilities. And coastal populations are already so vulnerable. In general, they're older and transient populations. They have higher unemployment rates and seasonal work. They're already quite isolated from mainland. So it is really important to help them address the new challenges that are coming up with climate change. And another thing that I wanted to mention is that due to coastal erosion, because the Isle is getting smaller and smaller, a lot of ecosystems are trying to move inland, but eventually scientists believe that a lot of them will go extinct because they're not going to find the right resources in order to keep living as they move more inland. So if we can move on to the next slide. So this is a quick video just on the current stage of my North Uist climate simulation. Again, it's based on real elevation data, and I've tried to recreate an area from their capital city, their capital town, and essentially the user can wander around. There's also some sound that comes with it, but it's just not, I don't think Zoom is allowing it. But there's many aspects to the immersion, and then the user is able then to press a button and the environment starts flooding. So my hope with this was to show how the roads would get blocked in the event of a storm. And of course, it's in its early stages. There's many other elements that I hope to add to it moving forward. So if we could move on to the next slides. This is some user feedback that we've gathered based on our North US climate simulation. A lot of people thought it's very interesting, engaging, and immersive. And I just wanted to add as well that this particular area, using VR to simulate the future impact of climate change, is still not researched enough, and a lot of scientists try to get more effort into it. So I really hope for my PhD I can investigate further and see how this way of learning and climate communication can really engage people in a way that influences ecological attitudes and perhaps behavior. So thank you very much for listening. We can move on now.
Okay, so this is my part. Thank you, Maria. So pull up my notes and see if it's on. Okay, everybody's still seeing the full screen, right? Sorry, I didn't mean to come out of full screen.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So coming off of the thread that Maria was talking about, and why this talk is called what it is called, is that we then proposed an application for a project called DASH, or Dash A, as some call it, but DASH. Digital Action on Climate Change with Heritage Environments. And it was recently funded. So with the Interreg Northern Periphery and Arctic program, through their Priority 2 call, which was climate change and resource efficiency, under the specific objective of promoting climate change adaptation and disaster risk prevention and resilience. And it's building upon work done on previous NPA project, CINE, which looked into transforming people's experiences with heritage through technology and building upon the idea of museum without walls. So the Northern Peripheral region is made up of very vibrant and unique communities which share challenges felt by northern regions, such as their remoteness and harsh weather conditions. And this new project aims to, one, build local capacity to raise awareness and response to climate change on vulnerable heritage within cultural landscapes. Two, to visualize global and local impact to heritage sites and communicate these climate stories to change perceptions and encourage shifts in behavior, as well as three, actively restore ecosystems for climate mitigation and create new visitor experiences. So each of these, the case studies that are involved in the project will contribute to three focus areas, creating a cycle of climate change monitoring, communication, and mitigation. So the first focus of work will be to investigate and implement methods in which citizen science, which Alan was speaking about, and educational tourism can help map and monitor cultural landscapes and the impacts of climate change through community engagement, crowdsourcing, gamification, and co-production methods. This directly continues the work from CINE, which in certain case studies leveraged local knowledge and input on recognizing changes over time. And one of the outputs was a mobile application that was developed for a local community and tourists in Iceland to map archaeological finds through the landscape for future monitoring and digitization, which then our citizen science approach will be built upon. The second focus will be to investigate the best use of emergent VR technologies to communicate global and predicted local impacts of climate change through climate stories and experiences. We've done quite a lot of work looking back into the past, but if we use the same methods for constructing the past to envision the future, will that motivate audiences to take action in order to preserve the heritage that they care about? This builds upon Maria's research and will be created to show the past as well as potential futures and museums and heritage organizations associated with partners in the project. Using an omni-channel approach to reach people in the ways they prefer, virtual exhibits will then be part of a multimodal toolkit that museums can continue to use and build upon beyond the life of the project. And the final focus area is on climate change mitigation through local engagement and resilient actions, through community action and communication. So this work will facilitate actual ecosystem restoration and associated management systems to take steps towards carbon neutrality while providing new uses of cultural landscapes. It'll also help to actively redevelop those landscapes while incorporating community in its planning and its restoration and management. And then this will build into a framework, which then uses all the elements of the project, including the monitoring and communication outputs, to bolster impact by community voices in discussions for change in environment, which could affect the cultural landscape. And that's actually such as sustainable energy discussions. So through these focus areas, we envision a continuous loop with more and more engagement, which continues to build into a guardianship cycle of cultural landscapes by both local communities and visitors alike. So there are 5 case studies for this area that are going to focus on the monitoring, communicating, and mitigating of the effects of climate change, but apply it into then concrete scenarios. So first one in Sweden, and I'm going to butcher all of these languages, I'm very sorry. In the Jämtland Härjedalen case study, we are going to explore how climate change adaptation and resilience can be conveyed in tourism settings, as the region is heavily reliant on tourism as one of its key industries. The case study then will focus on developing an open source framework, building on immersive and digital technologies for using climate change and heritage as a theme in visitor activities, which could be used then further developed by SMEs and local heritage associations. And then it will focus on AR and VR technologies and explore how citizen science then can be used in educational tourism. So the focus for them will be in the new geopark in Dalsfallen, which has been managed and created using a holistic concepts. And one of the key sites within the park is the Dead Falls, which is a dry river canyon. Used to be a large waterfall, but was part of a man-made disaster back in 1796, where the original river canyon was drained, the river was rerouted, and what's left is an emptied basin where then has turned into farmland. It is an example of immense human impact on the landscape, which is actually then a starting point for discussions and how actions can shape the future. In the area of new renewable energy production, while it's bolstering the green agendas, has changed the cultural landscape with affecting tourism, which raises the question of the future energy productions, but then also the influence that local community can have on mitigating those the energy production within their local areas. So Norway case study investigation will focus on Lofoten and Vegar areas above the Arctic Circle, which has been a main location for cod fishing in the Northern Atlantic. Climate change has, through the centuries, impacted the areas relying on fishing, but now the area is facing greater impact compounded by the warmer weather and rising humidity levels. Therefore, rising sea levels then endanger the local towns that are coastal and right on the water's edge. It also has a very long history of Sami culture. So the Sami used to be split into 2 groups. In the early 19th century, there were the fishermen Sami and then the reindeer Sami. And today, there's still some reindeer herders in the area, but the fishermen have mostly merged into the local populations. And the cultural landscape of the area has remained tangibly and intangibly connected to the Sami heritage, history, and way of life. So with these elements to focus on, this case study will develop and test tools based on the citizen science approaches, but also then the transmedia storytelling. They're going to host workshops and community engagement events to motivate and empower organizations and build the capacity within individuals and communities to then facilitate the digital solutions in their own climate action. So the Icelandic consortium in DASH has two full partners, one being the Gunnar Gunnarsson Institute located in East Iceland, as well as the Center for Digital Humanities and Arts, which operates under the University of Iceland. And their case study will focus on the Fljótsdalur Valley and the highlands that surround it. The area is rich in heritage sites, but also uninhabited wilderness and retreating glaciers. And parts of the highland are inscribed in the Ramsar Wetland Convention, and the associated national park is on the UNESCO's World Heritage List. So the area is also rich in green energy resources with a hydropower station and potential plans for building wind parks in the highlands. But that also then addresses the community's voices in the impending or jeopardizing perhaps outstanding value of the cultural landscape and its growing tourism. So peatlands have played a vital role in the survival of the Faroe Islands, as well as Iceland and Ireland, as there's little forest and was used as household heating and cooking, but all with differing peat cutting practices. People have been managing and draining peatlands to inhibit the spread of disease in sheep and to change the vegetation composition into a more favorable environment for agricultural and land use purposes. However, this is called peatland degradation and causes vast amount of greenhouse gas emissions. Peatlands, just as a brief with peat, are wetland ecosystems that accumulate dead organic matter, which is then produced in wet conditions and lack of aeration within the soil. Healthy peatlands are considered carbon sinks as well, and sequestering large amounts of carbon. And when cutting and burning the peat, the carbons then that's stored in the peat is released into the atmosphere. And similarly with draining and degradation of the peatlands also releases the carbon into the atmosphere. As when the decomposition begins, the peat slowly dries and allows the oxygen to enter the soil and causes carbon emissions. So protecting and restoring peatlands is therefore an important effort to mitigate climate crisis. So in the Faroes, the aim is to study the heritage of peat cutting as it's no longer a practice in the country. But the main contribution will be the restoration of a damaged peatland area in the Isle of Nólsoy, which will raise awareness of the importance of peatlands in the past as part of the community's heritage, but how it can also be restored to combat climate crisis today. Local crowdsourcing will help map healthy and drained peatlands, and communication through immersive and digital methods will help disseminate the criticality of peatlands on a global level, as well as their value on the local level. And so therefore the restoration on Nólsoy with local community engagement in the planning and in the management will create best practice that then can be implemented possibly in other regions. And briefly, because we're coming out on time, the Irish case study will be focused mostly in Donegal, with endangered heritage threatened by coastal erosions, rising sea levels, and extreme weather. So the built heritage and archaeological sites have to be evaluated, maintained, and monitored to understand the constant threat and impact on the sites. So some of those sites include McSwin's Castle, which was built in 15th century, and it sits on a small peninsula. St. Mura's Church on the Inishowen Peninsula, and the Inishkiel Island, which is only reachable at low tide. So this case study will focus specifically on engagement of youth and tourists to help preserve the sites through the citizen science data gathering, and then using our communication tools, the immersive exhibits, to demonstrate the potential climate futures as if these sites are lost to the sea or if they can be saved to remain part of the local cultural landscapes. And building upon what Maria was discussing about North Uist, with the focus on vulnerable Gaelic landscapes in Scotland, we're going to incorporate the work that we've been doing in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, which was part of the NPA North Sea region, but unfortunately It's not anymore, but on paper, it's not anymore. So we're going to align development of digital resources, infrastructures, and applications for museums, for the communities on the island of North Uist, which is the Outer Hebrides, which is this photo. So I think it gives a good idea of how low-lying and how wet the island is, but also with Islay, which is famous for peaty whiskey, but also very vulnerable to the North Atlantic, and the island of Sanday and Orkney, and the eastern coastal areas in Sutherland. The islands are some of the lowest lying islands in Scotland that are threatened inhabited areas due to the sea level rises. So we hoped to over the coming years to use the digital technologies to promote understanding of climate change and then promote action for climate mitigation, and do that collaboratively between the partners and associated communities. So that is me. Thank you. I don't know if we want to speak on anything else or open it up for a textual clap.
Oh, thank you very much, Jonathon. We can take questions, but I don't know, Jonathon, do you have a few words on?
Oh boy, maybe more than a few, but yeah, no, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, all three of you. So much going on here. I am, we announced in a previous session earlier today that next year we're going to be hosting our 10th annual international conference for the Immersive Learning Research Network in Scotland. And as the three of you know, we're really, really excited to, well, first of all, announce a theme that fits kind of what you've been presenting on and what you're researching. It's broadly tech for good, using the immersive learning to what end? For meaningful, inclusive, diverse, impactful results. And specifically, we would really like to highlight and focus the great work that you all are doing at the University of St. Andrews. And we've been having some initial discussions with you about possibly doing our Immerse Scotland, what we affectionately call our jet lag tour, which happens before the event to ease the people who have been flying from overseas into the new time zone, possibly coming to St. Andrews and touring your lab at the University of St. Andrews in the computer science department. So this really seems like a good opportunity for iLRN, the whole network, to start thinking about how we might be able to use our collective power to start meeting United Nations sustainability goals, create, massive game jams, involving students and people from all different walks of life. So I'm really crazy excited about all of this, and just wanted to what your reaction and what your some of the things that we might prepare for or do together.
So I'm excited
Yes.
to see the different avenues in which everyone can approach a similar challenge. From the different houses, from the different areas of research, being able to find solutions, but also explore areas that maybe are new for them to explore through something like this. And I think having more people at the table, having more voices heard, and also having different backgrounds come in can only be good, and can only come out with richer and more comprehensive, or able to answer the questions in different ways that then ultimately might actually help and do different things to mitigate the climate crisis. So I'm very excited about it, and to see what comes out through other people's research.
What kinds of things do you think we might get started here as students come back to school in the fall? To start thinking about projects or ways that people might be able to align their research to do good broadly, but maybe specifically around climate change.
Well, I think that I do this course on digital promotion and preservation of heritage, and I've been doing it kind of every year. But this year we had much more of a focus on climate change, which I think is justifiable, because heritage is about passing things on from one generation to the next. So if we mess up the planet, then there's no heritage at all, really. So so digital preservation and promotion of heritage involves climate change thing. But I mean, it's a kind of optional thing. But we had almost twice as many people taking the course. When it became clear that there was going to be this this context to it, and a big take up in terms of kind of enthusiasm and investment by people in the projects, and I think one of the things that I took out of it was that when somebody goes, well, okay, I'm going to look at this kind of sort of particular piece of heritage or a particular location or a particular subject, then the concrete realization of climate change is different in these different places. In the Barrier Reef, a couple of degrees essentially kills off the reef. In islay, changing the temperature affects the whiskey. And I'm sure you appreciate a bottle of whiskey, but I mean, on islay there's like 8 malt distilleries, and peat and the health of peat is really important in that, at least for the sort of islay whiskies. And so it's kind of surprising when you look at each topic and what kind of comes through from that. And so I think that we all have a role to play in that, to looking at, well, what does it actually mean concretely for the location that I'm in, or the location that I'm interested in, and then how can that be communicated? Because I think that this is the thing about the sort of, it needs to happen at 2 levels, because climate change is a global phenomenon. So we need to be able to see, understand what's happening with the Sahara Desert expanding, with the fires, but also at the poles, because particularly the North Pole and the South Pole, is where the most extreme what are those processes that are happening? And they can seem far away, but immersive technologies have the ability to bring those, into localities. And then also this thing about, well, what is climate change where I live? Because where we are, there's the biggest colony of gannets in the world nearby, and a very large proportion have died as a result of bird flu in the last couple of years. Massive sort of impact on, to the sense that you're walking along the beach, you're likely to see a dead gannet, and that's climate change, right? It doesn't really, the news doesn't say there's climate change is killing all of the gannets, but the temperatures rise, the nature of the fish in the area changes, that undermine, so there's less food for them, so that makes them less healthy, makes them vulnerable to epidemic, and you have the cold flu, and you have the avian flu epidemic being much more virulent and nasty than in previous years. So I think that we have kind of technology that is in our grasp, that we have control over, and we can use that technology to help people sort of overcome these divisions and deflections that happen a lot in terms of the media. I mean, you'll be aware of this with before we even start talking about the Trumps of the world and so, the sort of denialist people who exist as well. And and I think that a really interesting question is that of fossil fuels, because a lot of the time when people talk, we'll get the stuff about climate change, but we'll think, oh, it's down to the color of my bin or something that is going to solve it. And that's part of a solution, how much meat we eat and whether we choose to use a bike or that's part of it. But, at the end of the day, it's about fossil fuels or renewable fuels. And that's the responsibility of government and corporations. And it's our responsibility to hold them to account on it. And
that's right. That's right. This really inspires me so much. I would, based on what you were just saying, Alan, and the presentation's really good stuff, by the way. But I wonder if we might, as we start preparing for coming to Scotland and launching this theme across the world through our different chapters, if we do sort of what you're just saying, like challenge the different geographic regions to contextualize climate change from their cultural, geographic perspectives. And then also the second piece was using immersive environments to visualize the invisible, the abstract, the separated in time, as a way of making it concrete so people can feel that. Wouldn't that be so powerful if we could all arrive in Scotland with a collection of representations from around the world, localized to those spaces, and be able to maybe move the mark on people's perceptions, people's understanding. It's
I think it's, I think so. I really do think so. And I think, you mentioned the thing about cultural landscapes, is that when we look at heritage, or when we look at the places where we live, that they bring together the natural and the person-made. They bring together the intangible, the tangible, and all of these sorts of things.
Yeah.
But when we were doing technology and immersive stuff 10 years ago, it was buildings or that sort of scale of things. But the computers and the graphics cards and the technology today enables us to model it, and enables people to engage immersively with environments which include all of those, to a scale of 30, 40, 100 miles on a one-to-one scale. And that was not true kind of 10 years ago. So I think that it's kind of like the technology that we have available to us now is appropriate for use by not just one or two international museums, but it's appropriate to the use by whole networks of museums in terms of the accessibility, in terms of the digital literacies, in terms of the cost. So it really is, something that is sitting there, kind of waiting to be done on the sort of scale that you're mentioning. And so we would love to welcome everybody from iLRN to come to St Andrews. That would be really lovely for that to happen. And we have climate scientists, and we have geographers, historians, all of these people. I'm sure would love to meet meet yourselves. Well, we can tour you around the cathedral, which was built in the 12th century, and show you what it would have looked like in the 12th century. We can get our historians to introduce that to you. We can show you the castle, half of which has fallen into the sea, by the way. So this sort of coastal erosion thing is something that has been going on for quite a long time, but is accelerated by climate change. So we can do all of that, but we'd be really fascinated to hear, about the tales and the visualizations of climate change in Montana, the wisdom of indigenous people and how they've coped with climate change or changes in their environments in the past, and what we can learn from that. I think that there's a whole sort of richness of that our community can really engage with, and there's a growing appetite for it as well, I think. And unfortunately, the truth is that this is all going to become more and more relevant, you know, because there is so much that is already built in that we can't sort of reverse. So the climate is going to be changing over the next 10 years and is going to be warming. What we do now will maybe affect what happens in 10, 20, 30 years time, and will define what sort of world our children, you know, our children live in. But that pressure is going to be on us. And so that the you know, the important thing is that the scale of the problem doesn't make people frightened, doesn't make people feel powerless, because if they do, then we won't be able to solve the problem. The important thing is that there actually is action that can give people hope and a sense of power, that we have some control over our environment. And at the end of the day, the thing which defines humanity compared to all other life on this planet is that we are able to look at the environment that we are in, think about what is happening with it, and change it. And now, in a sense, that's why we've got climate change at the moment, but it's also why we can do something about it and stop it and reverse it.